Rebecca Lynn had known, in the abstract way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually darkens, that the divorce would be a fight about the house. What she hadn't expected was how much it would feel like being tried for a crime she hadn't committed, sitting in that hard wooden chair at the defendant's table, as if wanting to keep the home she'd built was itself the offense. She and Daniel had bought the narrow craftsman on Birchwood Lane 6 years earlier, back when they were still the kind of couple who finished each other's sentences and treated grocery shopping like a date. The house had been a wreck when they found it, sagging gutters, a kitchen from 1974, wiring that made their inspector visibly nervous, but Rebecca had seen past all of it to the bones underneath. Wide plank oak floors under 3 layers of ugly carpet. A porch with good structural framing beneath decades of peeling paint. A backyard big enough for a garden, a swing set, a life. The down payment had come from Vivian, Daniel's mother, a fact that had seemed, at the time, like nothing more than generosity. Vivian had money, old money, from her late husband's manufacturing business, and she'd offered the funds over a Sunday dinner with a kind of casual magnanimity that made refusing feel almost rude. "Consider it help," Vivian had said, waving a hand as if the $60,000 were pocket change. "You two work so hard." Rebecca remembered being grateful. She remembered hugging Vivian in the driveway afterward, genuinely moved. It was only years later, after the marriage had started fraying at its seams, after Daniel's late nights at the office turned into late nights that weren't really at the office, after the two of them stopped talking about anything beyond scheduling logistics, and whose turn it was to pick up their daughter Maya from ballet, that the down payment resurfaced. It resurfaced in Vivian's mouth as a loan. Never mind that no paperwork had ever been drawn up. Never mind that Vivian had never once, in 6 years, mentioned repayment, interest, or terms. The moment the marriage cracked, the money transformed retroactively into leverage, and Vivian wielded it with the practiced ease of a woman who had clearly been waiting for the opportunity. "That house was never really yours to begin with," Vivian told Rebecca once, during a stilted holiday visit the December before the divorce filing, Maya asleep upstairs and Daniel conveniently absent, running some last-minute errand. "I funded it. I should have some say in what happens to it." Rebecca hadn't argued. She'd learned, over 6 years of marriage, that arguing with Vivian was like arguing with weather. Pointless, exhausting, and ultimately beside the point, because Vivian would simply restate her position louder until the conversation ended on her terms. Instead, Rebecca had gone quiet, filed the comment away, and started doing something she hadn't done before. Paying closer attention. She started keeping records. Not out of any grand strategic foresight. At first it was simple frustration, a need to have proof of the things she'd contributed so that at least she would remember them clearly, even if no one else did. The new roof, installed the summer Maya turned 3, after a storm tore through half the shingles, Rebecca had found the contractor, negotiated the price down, and paid for it entirely out of a small inheritance from her grandmother, a woman who'd worked as a seamstress her whole life and left Rebecca a modest nest egg with a note that said, "Use this for something that's really yours." The rewired electrical, done the following spring after an inspector flagged the old knob and tube wiring as a fire hazard, also paid from that same inheritance, along with careful documentation Rebecca kept in a manila folder at the back of her closet. The porch restoration, 2 summers of her own physical labor, sanding railings by hand while 7 months pregnant with Maya, refusing Daniel's half-hearted offers to help because she'd wanted, stubbornly, to do it herself. The kitchen renovation, the one Vivian loved to take partial credit for at dinner parties despite having contributed nothing beyond opinions about cabinet hardware. Rebecca kept every receipt, every invoice, every bank statement showing the withdrawals from her grandmother's inheritance account, time-stamped and dated alongside contractor invoices for the corresponding work. She didn't know yet what she'd do with any of it. She simply understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that someday she might need to prove, to a judge, to Daniel, to herself, that this house had not been handed to her. She had built it, piece by piece, with her own hands and her own money, and 6 years of unglamorous labor nobody else in the family had bothered to notice. When the marriage finally ended, not with a single dramatic rupture but with a slow, mutual exhaustion that both of them recognized before either said it aloud. Rebecca found her lawyer through a friend of a friend. Preeti Andrade wasn't flashy. Her office was a converted second bedroom above a dry cleaner, her business cards slightly out of date, her demeanor so mild that Rebecca had worried, during their first consultation, that she'd chosen someone too soft for what was coming. She was wrong about that within the first 10 minutes. "Tell me about the house," Preeti had said, and listened, really listened, taking notes in small, precise handwriting as Rebecca laid out the down payment, the alleged loan with no paperwork, Vivian's growing insistence that the property should revert to Daniel and, by extension, to her. When Rebecca mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the folder of receipts she'd been keeping for years, Preeti's pen stopped moving entirely. "You have documentation for all of that? Dated, itemized, tied to a separate inheritance account." "Every bit of it," Rebecca said. Preeti smiled, the first real smile Rebecca had seen from her. "Good," she said. "Then we're not fighting to keep a house. We're fighting to be paid for one you already own the better half of." What followed was months of mediation sessions in beige conference rooms. Vivian's attorney, a sharp-suited man named Garrett Voss who billed by the quarter hour and never once made eye contact with Rebecca directly, pushing hard for a full reversion of the property to Daniel's name. Vivian sat in on nearly every session, uninvited but somehow never turned away, offering commentary Preeti mostly ignored and occasionally countered with a mildness that seemed, in retrospect, almost surgical. Rebecca, for her part, agreed to nearly everything Vivian's side proposed. She agreed to sign over her formal ownership interest in the house. She agreed to a settlement figure for the marital assets that Daniel's family clearly considered a victory. She watched Vivian's confidence swell with every session, watched Garrett Voss grow visibly more relaxed as the weeks went on, certain they were steamrolling a woman too tired or too outmatched to put up a real fight. What none of them noticed, because none of them thought to ask, because Vivian had decided from the very beginning that Rebecca was simply not clever enough to be a genuine obstacle, was that 2 weeks before the final court date, Preeti quietly filed a separate property amendment with the county recorder's office. Not part of the divorce settlement itself, not something that would be litigated or contested in the family court proceedings, but a standalone legal filing built entirely from Rebecca's meticulous folder of receipts and 6 years of undeniable, documented contribution to a house that was about to be signed away in a courtroom that had no idea what it was actually looking at. So when the court date finally arrived and Rebecca sat at the defendant's table across from Vivian's triumphant pearls, and Preeti stood to announce that her client was prepared to sign, Rebecca felt something unexpected settle over her. Not defeat. Not even nervousness. Just a quiet, patient calm. The calm of a woman who understood, better than anyone else in that courtroom, exactly what she was about to give away and exactly what she wasn't. Vivian didn't read the settlement packet in full that night, not really. She skimmed it the way she skimmed most documents Garrett handed her, trusting that he'd flagged anything important, that her son's interests and, by extension, her own, were being properly protected by a man she paid $400 an hour to protect them. She'd been so certain of victory in that courtroom, so satisfied by the sight of Rebecca's steady hand signing away her claim to the house, that the drive home had felt almost celebratory. She'd stopped at her favorite wine shop and bought a bottle of Chardonnay she usually saved for actual occasions. It was Daniel who called her, 3 days later, sounding strange. "Mom, did you look at the whole settlement? Like, all of it?" "Of course I did," Vivian said, though this wasn't entirely true. "Why?" "Our real estate agent called. She says there's some kind of easement filed against the property. And a lien." Vivian felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she wasn't yet sure why. "What kind of lien?" "I don't know, Mom. That's why I'm calling you. She says it's substantial." Vivian hung up and went straight to her home office, where the settlement packet had been sitting untouched in a manila folder since the courthouse, exactly where she'd tossed it after that satisfying glass of celebratory wine. She spread the pages across her desk under the harsh light of her reading lamp and started actually reading, not skimming, not scanning for the parts that confirmed what she already believed, but reading every clause the way she should have from the beginning. Page 4 stopped her cold. The document was titled, in language dry enough to be almost soothing, Amendment to Real Property, Easement and Lien Recordation. It had been filed with the county recorder's office 2 weeks before the court date, entirely separate from the divorce proceedings, meaning it hadn't been something the judge had approved or even seen, because it hadn't needed to be. It was a private legal filing between property co-owners, executed and recorded while Rebecca still held her interest in the house, and it was now permanently attached to the property's title, irrespective of who technically held the deed going forward. The easement granted Rebecca Lynn permanent, irrevocable access rights across the rear third of the property. Vivian read the legal description twice before the geography clicked into place in her mind. It covered the section where the detached garage sat, the flat stretch of yard that backed onto the greenbelt, the exact portion of the lot that Frank Delacroix, the buyer Vivian had been quietly courting for months, a developer with plans to subdivide and build a second home on that back parcel, had specifically wanted. Without unobstructed access through that easement zone, the rear section was landlocked. No permits, no construction, no subdivision. It was, in practical terms, dead weight. Vivian's hands had started to shake slightly by the time she got to the second document. The lien was for $84,000, filed in Rebecca's name, and it laid out, in the same maddeningly calm legal language, 6 years of documented capital improvements, a new roof, complete electrical rewiring, a full porch restoration, a kitchen renovation. Each item was itemized with dates, contractor invoices, and bank statements showing withdrawals from an account that, Vivian realized with mounting horror as she read the attached documentation, traced back to an inheritance Rebecca had received from her grandmother years before the marriage had even started fraying. None of it was marital money. All of it was documented, dated, and airtight. The lien would have to be paid in full, to Rebecca, personally, before the property could be sold to anyone. Vivian called Daniel back within the hour, her voice climbing steadily from confusion into something closer to panic. "Did you know about this? Did you read this before you signed?" "I signed where Garrett told me to sign," Daniel said, and Vivian could hear, even through the phone, the particular flatness of a man realizing he'd been more passenger than driver in his own divorce. "I trusted you had it handled, Mom. I trusted Garrett had it handled," Vivian snapped, though even as she said it she understood how thin that excuse sounded. Garrett had reviewed the settlement's core terms, custody arrangements, asset division, the reversion of the house to Daniel's name, and had considered his job largely finished. The property amendment, filed separately and quietly through the county recorder rather than through the family court itself, had simply never crossed his desk in any form that registered as urgent. By the time he did review it, calling Vivian the next morning with an uncharacteristically subdued tone, the filing was already recorded, already binding, already essentially unchallengeable outside of a lawsuit that Preeti Andrade, as Garrett explained with visible reluctance, would almost certainly win, given the sheer weight of documentation behind it. "We can contest it," Garrett said, though he didn't sound convinced. But Ms. Lynn's attorney did this cleanly. Very cleanly. "It's not part of the divorce settlement, so we can't touch it through an appeal of that. It's a straightforward property filing based on documented financial contribution. Contesting it means suing her directly, and given what I'm seeing in these receipts, I wouldn't recommend it." Vivian sat with that for a long moment, the Chardonnay from 3 nights earlier long gone flat in her memory, replaced by a slow, curdling realization. She had laughed in that courtroom. She had laughed, loudly enough that the judge had glared at her, because she'd been so certain that watching Rebecca sign away the house meant watching Rebecca lose. She hadn't considered, not for one second, that a woman who spent 2 summers sanding porch railings by hand while pregnant might also be the kind of woman who quietly kept 6 years of receipts in a manila folder, waiting for exactly the moment when they'd matter most. Frank Delacroix's team ran their own title search within the month, as any competent buyer's team would before closing on a $400,000 property. It took his real estate attorney all of 20 minutes to find the recorded easement and lien, and less than a day after that for Frank himself to call Vivian directly, his tone considerably less warm than it had been over the steak dinner, where he'd first laid out his subdivision plans. "I can't build anything back there without clear access," he said. And I'm not paying full price for a property with an $84,000 lien attached to it that I'd essentially be assuming. I'm out, Vivian. I'm sorry. He wasn't the only one. Vivian listed the house through a different agent in October, dropping the price twice over the following months as prospective buyers' attorneys kept turning up the same complications during due diligence. One offer fell through when the buyer's lender refused to finance a property with an active lien of that size. Another fell through when the buyer, a retired couple hoping to build a small guest cottage on the back lot for visiting grandchildren, discovered the easement made that plan legally impossible. By the following spring, the house had been on and off the market 3 times, each failed sale a little more publicly humiliating than the last in a neighborhood small enough that everyone eventually heard the story in some garbled version. Did you hear about Vivian Chen's house? Something about a lien, her daughter-in-law of all people, whispered at the country club, at church, at the hair salon Vivian had frequented for 15 years. Daniel, for his part, mostly disappeared from the process after the first few months. He'd never wanted to keep the house in the first place, not really. It had always been more his mother's fixation than his own, a monument to a marriage he was relieved to be free of, and watching his mother wage a slow, losing war against a property tangled in liens and easements struck him as exhausting in a way that mirrored, uncomfortably, exactly why the marriage had ended. He started therapy that winter, something Rebecca noted with a kind of distant, unbothered surprise when Maya mentioned it after a weekend visit with her father. "Dad's talking to someone now," Maya had said, 7 years old and matter-of-fact about it in the way children are about their parents' inner lives. "He says it helps him think about things clearer." Rebecca had hoped genuinely that it did. Rebecca herself had moved on with a swiftness that surprised even her. She and Maya settled into a bright 2-bedroom apartment across town, 3rd floor, good light in the mornings, close enough to Maya's school that they could walk when the weather was good. She missed the porch some mornings, the particular quality of coffee tasted while sitting on railings she'd sanded herself, but she found she didn't miss it as much, or as often, as she'd once assumed she would. The house had been a project she'd poured herself into during years when pouring herself into something had felt necessary, a way of building permanence in a marriage that was quietly losing its foundation even as she reinforced the physical one. Once the marriage ended, she discovered the house had never really been the thing she was grieving. She heard about Vivian's mounting troubles the way most people in this story heard everything, secondhand, in fragments, through Daniel's increasingly apologetic and increasingly rare texts. "Mom's stressed about the house again," one read, sometime around the following June. "Sorry you're dealing with any of the fallout." Rebecca hadn't been dealing with any fallout at all, in truth. She'd simply been living her life, 3 states away in spirit if not in actual distance, while behind her, a lien she'd earned through 6 years of unglamorous, uncelebrated labor did exactly what it had been built to do. Vivian finally settled the lien in full 18 months after that afternoon in the courthouse. $84,000, wired directly to Rebecca's account, the single largest check Vivian had ever written to another human being who wasn't a contractor or a doctor. It was the only way to finally clear the title enough to sell the house to a young family who didn't care about the back lot's development potential and simply wanted a home with good bones and a porch that, the listing photos noted, had been recently and lovingly restored. Rebecca read that phrase in the listing one evening, scrolling idly on her phone after Maya had gone to bed, and found herself smiling, not with triumph, exactly, though there was some of that too, but with something closer to quiet vindication. She had built that porch railing by railing, receipt by receipt, and in the end, it had held up exactly as well as she'd built it to.